Bonjour, and welcome back to the podcast. Today we are talking about a city that has seen kings crowned, revolutions erupt, empires rise, collapse, and artists, writers, and philosophers reshape the world. A city of cafes, cathedrals, barricades, boulevards, and brilliance. Today we are talking about Paris. Now, Paris is one of those rare cities where history feels unavoidable. You can hardly walk a few streets without stumbling across something important. A medieval church stands beside a 19th century apartment block. Roman ruins hide beneath modern roads. A quiet square might once have been the site of a guillotine. And for over 2,000 years, Paris has remained at the centre of French history, politically, culturally, and sometimes violently. In this episode, we are going to trace the story of Paris from its origins as a small settlement on the River Seine, through the Middle Ages, the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, the rebuilding of a city in the 19th century, two world wars, and into the modern capital we know today. We'll look at the people who shaped it, the disasters that nearly destroyed it, and why Paris became one of the most influential cities on earth. So, make yourself comfortable, perhaps pour yourself a coffee, and let us travel to the banks of the Seine. This is the history of Paris. Let's begin. To understand how Paris became Paris, we need to go back more than 2,000 years, to a time where the city did not yet exist, at least not in the form we would recognise. Long before the grand boulevards, the cafes, the cathedrals, or the Eiffel Tower, this area was home to the Celtic tribe known as the Parisi. They lived along the River Seine in around the 3rd century BC, settling particularly round the small islands in the centre of the river. Now, this was not accidental. Rivers were the lifeblood of the ancient world. The Seine offered food, transport, trade, and protection. Anyone controlling this stretch of the river could control movement through the region, and the Parisi became successful traders because of it. Archaeologists believe the settlement itself was relatively small. Likely wooden buildings, narrow dirt paths, fishing boats, storage huts, and simple markets. It would have been noisy, muddy, smoky, and crowded, but strategically valuable. And then, inevitably, the Romans arrived. In the year 58 BC, Julius Caesar began his conquest of Gaul during what we now know as the Gallic Wars. Over several years, Roman armies pushed across modern France, Belgium, and surrounding territories, defeating tribe after tribe. The Parisi resisted Roman rule. In fact, during a major Gallic uprising led by Vercingetorix in 52 BC, the Parisi joined the rebellion against Caesar. According to Roman accounts, as Caesar's forces approached, parts of the settlement may have even been burned by the Gauls themselves to prevent it falling into Roman hands. But resistance ultimately failed. Rome conquered the region, and the land of the Parisi became part of the expanding Roman world. The Romans renamed the settlement Lutetia Parisarium, Lutetia of the Parisi. The word Lutetia may come from a Celtic term meaning something like marsh or swamp, which tells you quite a lot about what the area was probably like at the time. Now, when the Romans conquered the territory, they rarely left it untouched. Rome did not simply occupy places, it reshaped them. Over the following decades, Lutetia slowly transformed from a Celtic riverside settlement into a Roman town. Interestingly, the Romans developed most of the city on what is now the left bank of Paris, rather than on the islands themselves. The islands were useful defence, but the flatter land beyond gave the Romans more room to build properly planned streets and public buildings. And build they did. The Romans introduced paved roads, bridges, public baths, forums, temples, ad- aqueduct systems, and administrative buildings. Like many Roman towns, Lutetia was organized with surprising precision. Streets intersected in orderly patterns, stone buildings replaced many wooden structures, and Roman engineering began to dominate the landscape. Life in Roman Lutetia would have looked dramatically different from the earlier Celtic settlement. Citizens visited bathhouses not just to wash, but to socialize and conduct business. Merchants traded wine, pottery, grain, and imported goods from across the empire. Latin became the language of administration and law. Roman religion spread into the area, though local beliefs often survived alongside it. One of the most remarkable remnants of this period still exists today, the Arenas de Lutice. Hidden within the modern Latin Quarter are the remains of a Roman amphitheatre built sometime in the 1st century AD. Thousands of spectators once gathered there to watch theatrical performances, athletic contests, and possibly even gladiatorial combat. Imagine that for a moment. Which is now one of the intellectual centres of Paris. Crowds once roared inside a Roman arena. Nearby were the Roman baths as well, parts of which still survive in the Musée de Cluny. Massive stone walls and vaulted chambers remain standing nearly 2 millennia later, offering a glimpse into daily life in Roman Paris. Now, despite all this development, Lutetia was never one of Rome's greatest cities. It was important regionally, but certainly it was smaller than the major Roman centres like Lugdunum, modern Lyon, which served as the true Roman capital of Gaul. Lutetia perhaps had a population of several thousand people at its height, not enormous by Roman standards, but its location mattered. The Seine made it a useful trading hub, and over time the city continued to grow steadily in wealth and influence. Roman emperors even passed through occasionally. One of the most notable was Julian, later known as Julian the Apostate, who spent time in Lutetia in the 4th century AD. He reportedly liked the city's climate and described it rather fondly compared to other imperial centres. But by this point, trouble was beginning to spread far across the Roman Empire. From the 3rd century onwards, Rome faced increasing crises: invasions, political instability, economic decline, and civil wars. The empire became harder and harder to defend, and Lutetia began to feel that pressure. As raids and invasions threatened Roman territories, the inhabitants increasingly retreated back towards the defensible island in the Seine, what we now call the Ile de la Cité. Walls were strengthened, buildings outside safer areas were abandoned, the city contracted inward. The Roman world that had once seemed eternal was weakening. And slowly, Lutetia began its transformation from a Roman provincial town into something else entirely. The Roman Empire would fade from Gaul, but Rome's influence would remain embedded in the foundations of Paris itself, its roads, its layouts, its language, and its identity. Because although Roman Lutetia eventually disappeared, it gave Paris its first true structure as a city. And from those Roman foundations, medieval Paris would emerge. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire was beginning to collapse. For centuries, Rome had dominated Western Europe through military power, trade, engineering, and administration. The empire had grown too large, too expensive, and increasingly unstable. Civil wars weakened the government. The economy struggled, and pressure from invading groups along the borders intensified year after year. Gaul became harder to defend. Lutetia, once a comfortable Roman town, slowly turned into a fortified settlement. Many people abandoned the larger Roman districts on the left bank and moved back towards the safer Ile de la Cité in the centre of the Seine. The grand Roman baths and arenas began to fall into disrepair. Some buildings were dismantled entirely and their stones reused for defensive walls and newer structures. And then came the invasions. Groups such as the Franks pushed deeper into Roman territory as imperial authority weakened. Roman control over Gaul crumbled, and by the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had effectively ceased to exist. But all this is for another episode. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor was removed from power, an event traditionally used to mark the fall of the Roman Empire. But cities like Lutetia did not vanish overnight. Life continued, people still traded, worshipped, farmed, and governed themselves as best as they could. Yet the Roman world they had known was gone. And from its ruins, a new Europe began to emerge. One of the most important groups to rise in former Roman Gaul were the Franks, led by a king named Clovis. And it would be Clovis who transformed Lutetia into something far more recognisable to us today. Because under the Franks, Lutetia would begin to take on a new name. Paris. By the Middle Ages, Paris had transformed completely from the old Roman town of Lutetia. The city had survived the collapse of Rome, Viking raids along the Seine, outbreaks of disease, and centuries of political instability. Yet somehow it continued to grow. Under the Frankish kings, particularly the Capetian dynasty, Paris slowly became the political and cultural centre of France. But at the heart of the city stood the Ile de la Cité, the same island where the ancient settlement of Parisy had once stood centuries earlier. It was here, in the centre of the Seine, that one of the most famous buildings in human history would rise, Notre Dame de Paris. Now, before the cathedral existed, there had already been places of worship on the site for centuries. Historians believe a Roman temple may have once stood there, later replaced by early Christian churches as Christianity spread through France. But by the 12th century, Paris was growing rapidly. Its population was expanding, its importance increasing, and church leaders wanted a cathedral worthy of the city's rising status. The man who would begin that transformation was Bishop Maurice de Sully. In 1163, according to tradition, possibly in the presence of King Louis VII and even Pope Alexander III, construction on a vast new cathedral dedicated to the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame, meaning Our Lady. Now, it is difficult for us today to fully understand the scale of what medieval cathedrals represented. These were not simply churches, they were statements of wealth, faith, power, engineering, and ambition. Entire generations devoted their lives to building them. Some workers would begin construction knowing they would never live to see the finished structure. And Notre Dame was the greatest of them all. The cathedral was designed in the Gothic style, which at the time was revolutionary. Gothic architecture allowed buildings to rise higher than ever before through innovations such as pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, arcs-boutants. Now, the arcs-boutants sound rather ridiculous as a phrase, but they were an extraordinary engineering breakthrough. They transferred the immense weight of the roof outward into external supports, allowing walls to become thinner and taller. And that meant something remarkable. Light. Huge stained glass windows flooded the cathedral with colour. Sunlight poured through reds, blues, and golds, illuminating the interior in ways medieval worshippers had rarely seen before. To many people at the time, entering Notre Dame must have felt almost supernatural. Construction continued for nearly 2 centuries. Thousands of labourers, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, sculptors, and glassmakers worked on the cathedral across generations. The western facade, with its twin towers, slowly emerged over Paris. Gargoyles and statues lined the exterior. Bells were installed high above the city. And all the while, Paris itself continued growing around it. By the 13th century, Paris had become one of Europe's largest and most important of cities. Scholars gathered in the Latin Quarter, eventually forming what became the University of Paris. Markets crowded the streets, merchants crossed the bridges of the Seine, kings ruled increasingly from Paris rather than wandering constantly between royal estates. And Notre Dame stood at the centre of it all. The cathedral witnessed coronations, royal weddings, funerals, and national celebrations. It became deeply tied to the identity of France itself. But Notre Dame also survived darker periods. During the Hundred Years' War between England and France, Paris changed hands multiple times. In 1431, the English king Henry VI was crowned King of France inside Notre Dame during England's attempt to claim the French throne. And then came the French Wars of Religion in the 16th century, where Catholics and Protestants violently clashed across France. Much of Europe was tearing itself apart over religion, and Paris often stood directly in the middle of the chaos. Yet, the cathedral endured. By the 18th century, however, attitudes were beginning to change. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and revolutionaries increasingly viewed the Catholic Church as a symbol of royal oppression and inequality. Churches were attacked across France, clergy persecuted, and religious symbols destroyed. Notre Dame suffered heavily. Many statues on the facade were smashed by revolutionaries who mistakenly believed they represented French kings rather than biblical figures. Church treasures were looted, bells melted down, and parts of the cathedral were badly damaged. At one point, Notre Dame was even rededicated as a temple of reason during the Revolution's attempt to replace Christianity with revolutionary ideology. For a time, the cathedral fell into neglect, and it might have remained that way if it were not for literature. In 1831, the writer Victor Hugo published his novel Notre Dame de Paris, known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Hugo was horrified by the cathedral's deterioration and used the novel partially as a campaign to save the building. The book became enormously popular. Suddenly, public interest in the cathedral surged. People began to see Notre Dame not merely as a church, but as a masterpiece of French history and architecture. Massive restoration work began under architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Sorry, my French is not very good. Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Please again, like I did with the partition of India, say how I pronounce it in the comments. In the 19th century, spires were rebuilt, sculptures restored, and the cathedral repaired extensively. The famous central spire that many associated with Notre Dame for generations was actually part of this 19th century restoration. And so the cathedral entered the modern age. It survived revolutions, wars, occupations, and the industrial transformation of Paris itself. During the liberation of Paris in 1944, the bells of Notre Dame rang out across the city as German occupation ended. For centuries, the cathedral remained one of the most defining symbols of Paris. And then, in April 2029, disaster struck once again. A devastating fire tore through the roof of Notre Dame during restoration work. Flames engulfed the ancient timber framework, and millions around the world watched in horror as the great spire collapsed into the burning cathedral below. And, for a moment, it seemed possible that centuries of history might disappear in a single night. But remarkably, much of the structure survived, and almost immediately efforts began to restore Notre Dame once more, continuing a cycle that had defined the cathedral for over 800 years. Because Notre Dame is more than a building. And it is, in many ways, the story of Paris itself. A city damaged repeatedly, yet rebuilt again and again. By the 16th century, Paris had become one of the largest and most influential cities in Europe. The medieval city was crowded, noisy, and chaotic. Narrow streets twisted beneath timber-framed houses that leaned so close together above the road that neighbours could practically shake hands from the opposite windows. Open drains ran along the streets. Markets overflowed with traders and livestock, and the smell of smoke, sewage, bread, river water, and people filled the air constantly. Yet, despite filth and overcrowding, Paris was thriving. The population had likely grown to around 300,000 people by the mid-16th century, making it one of the biggest cities on the continent. Scholars, merchants, priests, craftsmen, nobles, beggars, students, and labourers all crowded within the city walls. Paris was not merely the capital of France politically, it was becoming its intellectual and cultural centre. The University of Paris, particularly the Sorbonne, had become one of Europe's leading centres of learning. Students arrived from across the continent to study theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. Latin echoed through lecture halls and the courtyards of the Latin Quarter, named precisely because of the language spoken there. And at the time, the Renaissance was spreading across Europe. Originating in Italy, Renaissance ideas emphasized art, literature, and science, and renewed interest in the education in the classical world of Greece and Rome. These ideas slowly reached France, influencing architecture, education, and royal culture. French kings increasingly embraced Renaissance styles, commissioning grand palaces and artistic works inspired by Italy. Paris began changing alongside them. Printing presses also transformed the city. Books became cheaper and more widely available, allowing ideas to spread faster than ever before. Printers in Paris published religious texts, scientific works, political arguments, and literature in enormous quantities. This was revolutionary. Knowledge was no longer limited solely to monasteries and elites. But with the spread of ideas came conflict. And in the 16th century France, religion became the great dividing force. The Protestant Reformation, began by Martin Luther in the early 16th century, challenged the authority of the Catholic Church across Europe. In France, Protestants became known as Huguenots. Paris, however, remained deeply Catholic. Tensions between the Catholics and the Huguenots steadily worsened throughout the century, eventually erupting into violence and war. And nowhere symbolised that violence more than Paris itself. The most infamous moment came in 1572, during St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands of Protestant Huguenots had gathered in Paris for the wedding of the Protestant Henry of Navarre and the Catholic Margaret of Valois, a marriage intended to ease religious tensions. Instead, as always, disaster unfolded. After an attempted assassination of the Protestant leader, fear and paranoia spread rapidly through the royal court and city. Orders were given to eliminate key Huguenot figures, but the violence spiraled completely out of control. Beginning on the night of the 23rd of August, mobs roamed through Paris attacking Protestants. Houses were broken into, people were dragged into the streets, and killings spread across the city for days. Thousands died in Paris alone, with further massacres occurring elsewhere in France afterward. The Seine reportedly carried bodies through the city. It remains one of the darkest episodes of French history. And yet Paris continued to grow, despite the instability. Markets expanded, bridges multiplied across the Seine, churches, colleges, and mansions continued to be built. Royal authority strengthened gradually under later kings. By the end of the 16th century, one man would emerge to finally bring a degree of stability back to France: Henry of Navarre, the very Protestant nobleman who had survived the massacre. He converted Catholicism in order to secure the French throne, reportedly declaring, "Paris is well worth a mass." As King Henry IV, he helped end decades of religious warfare and began major improvements to Paris itself. Under Henry, new squares and bridges and urban projects reshaped parts of the city. One of the most famous was the Pont Neuf, ironically meaning new bridge, which stands still today as the single oldest in Paris. And so, as the 16th century came close, Paris stood at a turning point. It was still, in many ways, crowded, dangerous, and deeply unequal, but it was also becoming something far more modern: a political capital, a cultural capital, and increasingly the centre of France itself. By the 18th century, Paris was entering a new age. The city was still crowded and unequal, but it also became one of the intellectual capitals of Europe. Philosophers, writers, scientists, and political thinkers filled its cafes, salons, university, and printing houses. Ideas spread rapidly through conversation and books, challenging old assumptions about monarchy, religion, and society itself. This was the age of the Enlightenment. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot questioned authority in ways that would have been almost unthinkable centuries earlier. They debated liberty, reason, science, education, and the rights of ordinary people. And while kings still ruled France, absolutely, the foundations beneath them were beginning to shift. Now, sitting above the Latin Quarter on the left bank is a building that reflects the transformation perhaps better than almost anywhere else in Paris: the Pantheon. However, it never intended to be a secular monument at all. The story begins with King Louis XV. In 1744, the king fell seriously ill while campaigning during the War of Austrian Succession. Believing he might die, Louis reportedly vowed that if he recovered, he would build a magnificent church dedicated to Saint Genevieve, the patron saint of Paris. And he did recover. So plans began for an enormous new church overlooking the city. The architect chosen was Jacques-Germain Soufflot, who designed a structure unlike any traditional church of the period. Soufflot combined classical inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome with modern engineering techniques, creating a building that looked almost Roman in its scale and symmetry. Construction began in 1758. Now, if you look at the Pantheon today, it immediately feels different from medieval Paris. Unlike the Gothic complexity of Notre Dame, the Pantheon is clean, geometric, balanced, and heavily influenced by classical antiquity. Its massive dome dominates the skyline of the Latin Quarter. Tall Corinthian columns line the facade, giving the building the appearance of a Roman temple transplanted into 18th century France. And that was entirely intentional. The Enlightenment admired the ancient world, particularly the democracy and republics of Greece and Rome, and architecture increasingly reflected those ideals. But history intervened before the church could fully settle into its original purpose. Because while construction continued, France itself was moving toward revolution. Economic crisis, food shortages, inequality, and anger toward the monarchy exploded in 1789, at the beginning of the French Revolution. Paris became the centre of upheaval. Crowds stormed the Bastille. Royal authority weakened, and revolutionary ideas spread rapidly through the city. Suddenly, buildings associated with religion and monarchy were viewed very differently. And so, shortly after its completion, the Church of Saint Genevieve was transformed. The revolutionaries secularized the building and turned it into a national mausoleum, a place to honor great figures of France rather than saints alone. It was renamed the Pantheon, inspired by the ancient Roman Pantheon. Above the entrance, a new inscription appeared: "Au roi haut la patrie reconnaissant." To great men, the grateful homeland. Now, This change symbolised something enormous. France was shifting from a society centred around monarchy and religion toward one increasingly focused on nationhood, citizenship, and secular ideals. The Pantheon became a monument not to kings, but to achievement. Over the centuries, many of France's most celebrated figures were buried there. Voltaire, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, Émile Zola, Marie Curie, Louis Braille, Josephine Baker. Some scientists, writers, resistance figures, philosophers, and political figures all came to rest beneath its great dome. And in many ways, the building reflects the contradictions of French history itself. At various points, it has switched repeatedly between church and secular monuments depending on who held the power at the time. Monarchies restored religious functions, republics returned it to a civil role. Even today, it carries both identities simultaneously. The Pantheon also became a masterpiece of engineering. Its enormous dome required complex structural solutions, and beneath hangs one of the building's most famous scientific demonstrations, Foucault's pendulum. In 1851, physicist Léon Foucault suspended a pendulum inside the Pantheon to demonstrate the rotation of the Earth. As the pendulum swung, its movements appeared to shift gradually due to the Earth turning beneath it. For many spectators at the time, it was astonishing. Science demonstrated publicly inside a building originally intended as a church. And perhaps that perfectly captures what the Pantheon represents. It stands at the crossroads of religion, science, revolution, and national identity. A building born from royal devotion, transformed by revolution, and ultimately dedicated to the idea of France itself. By the late 18th century, Paris was no longer just a city of ideas and architecture. It was a city on the edge of collapse. The Enlightenment had filled cafes and salons with talk of reason, liberty, and equality, but beneath those conversations lay a very different reality. Food shortages, crushing taxation, and monarchy increasingly out of touch with the people it ruled. And at the centre of that monarchy ruled one of the most famous and most misunderstood figures in French history, Marie Antoinette. Born as an Austrian archduchess, Marie Antoinette arrived in France as a teenager and married to the future King Louis XVI as a political alliance between Austria and France. She entered a court already steeped in ritual and expectation, where the royal family lived largely separated from the daily struggles of ordinary Parisians. Much of her early reputation was shaped not only by her actions, but by rumours, propaganda, and growing hostility towards the monarchy itself. At Versailles, far outside Paris, she became a symbol of royal extravagance in the public imagination, whether or not every accusation was fair or accurate. As France's economic situation worsened in the 1780s, that image became politically explosive. Bread prices rose, hunger spread, and while many Parisians struggled to survive, the monarchy was increasingly seen as indifferent to their suffering. In pamphlets and political cartoons circulating through Paris, Marie Antoinette was often portrayed as a figure of excess and detachment, sometimes even falsely attributed with the phrase, "let them eat cake," a line historians argue she almost certainly never said. But in a time of crisis, truth often matters less than symbolism. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Paris became its beating heart. The storming of the Bastille marked the collapse of royal authority in the city. Revolutionary crowds filled the streets, demanding a change that went far beyond reform. The monarchy, once unquestioned, was now openly challenged. And as events accelerated, the royal family found themselves increasingly trapped by the very system. In 1791, the attempted escape from Paris, often called the Flight to Varennes, failed disastrously. The king and queen were captured and brought back to the capital under guard. From that moment on, the monarchy was no longer simply seen as weak. it was seen as untrustworthy. Paris itself became the stage for revolutionary justice. In 1792, the monarchy was abolished. A republic was declared. The royal family was imprisoned in the Temple prison in Paris, and their lives now controlled by revolutionary authorities. And then came the final breaking point. In 1793, Louis XVI was executed in Paris after being convicted of treason. Not long after, Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Her trial was swift, and the outcome was already decided by the political climate of the time. She was accused of treason and other charges tied to the revolution's fears of internal enemies and foreign intervention. On the 16th of October, 1793, she was executed in Paris. The monarchy she had been born into and had once represented was gone. But her death did not end the revolution. It intensified it. Paris entered a period of extreme political turmoil known as the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary leaders, driven by fear of counter-revolution, carried out widespread executions across the city. The same streets that had once echoed with Enlightenment debate were now defined by suspicion and political violence. Yet even in this chaos, Paris was being reshaped into something new. Churches were renamed or closed. Old institutions were dismantled. Symbols of the monarchy were destroyed or repurposed. The city was being rebuilt not physically but ideologically into the capital of a new kind of nation. Marie Antoinette's story, whether seen as a tragedy, cautionary tale, or political symbol, became inseparable from this transformation. She was not only a queen who fell with the monarchy, but a symbol of the end of an entire world order. From the ashes of that world, modern France and modern Paris began to emerge. The French Revolution did not begin in a single moment, but in a build-up of pressure that Paris could no longer contain. The country was in debt after years of war, including support for the American Revolution. Taxes were uneven and unfairly distributed, with the burden falling heavily on ordinary people, while the nobility and clergy were largely exempt. Meanwhile, the poor harvest had driven the price of bread, staple food for most Parisians, to desperate levels. Eventually, feudalism was gone, the monarchy was gone, the old privileges of birth were gone. In their place, the idea of the modern French nation was taking shape. A nation based on citizenship rather than class, law rather than privilege, and ideals rather than tradition. By 1794, the Terror reached its own leaders, including Robespierre himself, who was eventually arrested and executed. The extreme phase of the revolution collapsed, but its consequences remained. Paris had been transformed. It had overthrown its kings, reshaped its institutions, and redefined the relationship between people and power. And as the dust began to settle, a new figure was already rising from the chaos, one who would reshape Paris and France entirely: Napoleon Bonaparte. When the revolution finally settled, Paris was left changed beyond recognition. The monarchy was gone. It was something entirely new. And at the centre of it stood a man who would reshape Paris in both image and identity: Napoleon. He did not rise in Paris as a king returning to tradition, but as a product of the revolution itself. He represented order after chaos, structure after upheaval, and ambition after collapse. And unlike the revolutionary leaders before him, he understood something crucial. To control France, he also had to reshape its capital. When Napoleon came to power at the end of the 18th century, Paris was still a city of medieval streets and uneven development. It was beautiful in parts, but also crowded, unsanitary, and inefficient. Napoleon's response was not gradual reform, it was transition through planning. He saw Paris not just as a city, but as a symbol of the French state. One of his most famous contributions was the creation of monumental architecture designed to reflect military victory and national pride, inspired by the Roman Empire. Perhaps the clearest example of this was the Arc de Triomphe. But the Arc was not completed in Napoleon's lifetime. It would take decades to finish, becoming instead a monument that outlived the man who ordered it. Napoleon also transformed Paris administratively. He reorganized the government structure, centralized authority, and improved an infrastructure in ways that had made the city function more efficiently. Roads were widened where possible, bridges repaired, the public institutions strengthened, the established systems of law and administration that would shape France long after his rule had ended, including the Napoleonic Code, which standardized legal principles across the country. Most famously, the Louvre was transformed into a public museum. What had once been a royal palace became a space where art was displayed not for private kings, but for the nation. This shift was symbolic. Culture itself was being nationalized. And yet Napoleon's Paris was also a city of contradiction. Beneath the grand monuments and organised reforms, much of the city still struggled with overcrowding and poverty. Still, Napoleon succeeded in one crucial respect. He gave Paris a sense of imperial identity once again. After the chaos of the Revolution, Paris was no longer just a revolutionary capital, it was the capital of an empire. And even after Napoleon's eventual defeat and exile, much of what he built remained. His monuments, institutions, and vision of a powerful, centralised France became embedded in the city's identity. Because Napoleon did not rule Paris for a moment in history. He reshaped it for a century that followed. If there is one monument that captures Napoleon's vision of Paris, it is, of course, the Arc de Triomphe. Standing at the western end of the Champs-Élysées, it is impossible to miss. Vast, commanding, and deliberately overwhelming in scale. It does not sit quietly within the city, it dominates it. And that was exactly the intention. The Arc was commissioned in 1806 by Bonaparte following his victory at Austerlitz. At that moment, Napoleon was at the height of his power, and he wanted Paris to reflect the strength of his empire. The monument was not designed simply as decoration, but a statement, a declaration of victory, a symbol of military glory, and a physical embodiment of national pride. Inspired by the triumphal arches of ancient Rome, Napoleon wanted to place France in the same imperial lineage. Construction began under architect Jean Calruin, who designed the Arc on an enormous scale. Today, standing beneath it, you are lucky if you are struck by its sheer height and mass. It feels less like a building and more like a carved fragment of history placed into the city. Like many grand projects, it was not completed quickly. In fact, it would take decades. By the time the Arc was strategically finished, Napoleon himself was long gone, defeated, exiled, and dead on the Isle of St. Helena. The monument he had ordered to celebrate his victories became instead something more complicated, a memorial to a vanished empire and a turbulent century of French history. Yet its meaning did not fade, instead it grew. As Paris changed through revolution, restoration, and industrial expansion, the Arc remained a constant presence. It became a backdrop to parades, political upheaval, and national ceremonies. Famously, the Tour de France hasn't recently, up the Champs-Élysées and at the Arc de Triomphe. Underneath it lies the tomb of the unknown soldier, added after the First World War. An eternal flame burns there, commemorating French soldiers who died without identification. Each evening the flame is rekindled, a ritual of remembrance that connects modern France to its past sacrifices. This edition transformed the Arc once again. The Arc de Triomphe stands at the intersection of those layers. Roman inspiration, revolutionary aftermath, Napoleonic Empire, modern remembrance. All of it meeting in a single monumental arch above Paris. In 1889, France prepared to host the World's Fair, the Exposition Universelle, to mark the century of the French Revolution. It was meant to showcase French innovation, industry, and global influence. The centerpiece of this exhibition would become one of the most famous structures ever built, if not the most, the Eiffel Tower. The tower was designed by Gustave Eiffel and his company, though the detailed structure work was carried out by his team of engineers, including Maurice Cochon and Émile Nourgeot. At the time, it was a radical idea, a massive iron lattice tower rising above Paris, not from stone in the classical tradition, but from an industrial metal. Paris had long been associated with cathedrals, palaces, monuments, and carefully designed boulevards. The exposed iron tower, visible from almost anywhere in the city, seemed to some like an intrusion. Construction moved quickly. When it was finished in 1889, it stood at 300 metres tall, making it the tallest man-made structure in the world. For visitors to the Exposition Universelle, it was breathtaking. Lifts carried people up its levels, offering views of Paris unlike anything seen before. But the Eiffel Tower was never intended to be permanent. It was originally planned to be dismantled after 20 years. However, something unexpected happened, and it proved useful. It became a platform for scientific experiments, particularly in radio transmission. Its height made it an ideal for communication technology, and as the 20th century approached, its practical value helped secure its survival. Over time, public opinion shifted. What had once been criticised began to be admired. The tower became a symbol of modern France, its engineering skill and its ambition, its willingness to embrace the future. But what perhaps makes the Eiffel Tower truly remarkable is not just its appearance or size, but it represents within the story of Paris. Because unlike Notre Dame, which speaks of faith, or the Pantheon, which speaks of ideals, or the Arc de Triomphe, which speaks of empire, the Eiffel Tower speaks of modernity. It's a monument, not to the past, but to progress. And in that sense, it marks a turning point in the history of Paris. By the 20th century, Paris had firmly established itself as the cultural capital of the world. Writers, painters, composers, and thinkers gathered in the city from across Europe and America and beyond, drawn by its cafes, academies, galleries, and restless creative energy. At the centre of this artistic universe stood one institution more important than any other, the Musée du Louvre. Once a royal palace, transformed during the Revolution into a public museum, the Louvre had become a vast home for some of the greatest artworks ever created, and within its walls rested a painting that for centuries had been respected, but not yet world famous. The Mona Lisa. Painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the early 16th century, the portrait of Lisa Gherardini had spent most of its life quietly within the royal collections of France. That changed dramatically in 1911. On a quiet morning in August, the painting vanished. An Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia, who had previously worked at the Louvre, entered the museum and simply removed the Mona Lisa from the wall, hid it under his coat, and walked out of the building. At first, the disappearance went unnoticed. When it was discovered, the news spread rapidly. Her most important paintings had been stolen from one of the world's most famous museums. Panic followed. The Louvre was closed, police investigations began, guards, staff, and even artists were questioned. Newspapers across France and beyond reported on theft daily, turning it into an international sensation. And paradoxically, this is what made the painting famous. Before the theft, the Mona Lisa was respected. After, it became legendary. For 2 years, the painting remained missing. Then in 1913, Perugia attempted to sell it to Florence, claiming he was returning it to Italy. He was arrested, and the Mona Lisa was recovered and returned to France. From that moment on, millions of visitors would travel to Paris not only for its monuments of history, but to stand in front of a single painting. And in doing so, the Mona Lisa created one of the most famous artworks in human history, not because it was suddenly created, but because it was suddenly lost and then found again. By the time the Second World War began, Paris was once again a city that seemed to embody the contradictions of history. On the surface, it remained the Paris of cafes, boulevards, museum, and intellectual life. Then in 1940, everything changed. German forces advanced rapidly through northern France in a lightning campaign. French and Allied defences collapsed faster than many believed possible. Refugees began fleeing towards the capital as the front lines moved closer and closer. And finally, Paris itself became vulnerable. In June 1940, German troops entered the city without major resistance. The French government had already left, and Paris was declared an open city to avoid further destruction. For the next 4 years, Paris lived under German control. The city remained outwardly intact, its architecture largely preserved, but its freedom was gone. German military administration took control, and daily life had been shaped by curfews, restrictions, shortages, and surveillance. Yet Paris did not remain passive. Underground resistance networks formed across the city and surrounding regions. Citizens engaged in acts of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and secret communication with Allied forces. As the war turned against Germany, Allied forces advanced toward France in 1940. The liberation of Paris became both a military and symbolic objective. Soon, Allied forces entered the city, led in part by Free French troops under General Charles de Gaulle. On the 25th of August 1944, Paris was officially liberated. One of the most powerful images of that moment was the sound of church bells ringing across the city, including those of Notre Dame de Paris, announcing the end of occupation and the return to freedom. But liberation did not erase the memory of occupation. Paris had endured fear, collaboration, resistance, and loss, to survive intact physically, but profoundly changed in spirit. After the Second World War, Paris did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward, but it also deepened its identity. Unlike cities that had reinvented itself by replacing the past, Paris is something more unusual. It accumulated it. In the decades that followed, the layered city became something powerful, a global centre of influence across art, literature, philosophy, and film. In the most immediate post-war years, Paris was once again a meeting point for thinkers and writers. Cafes in the neighbourhood like Saint-Germain-des-Prés, filled with extensionist philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, who debated freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of human existence in the shadow of recent history. Writers from around the world came to Paris not just to live, but to write. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and many others already made the city a centre of modernist writing in the early 20th century. The city's museums also played a crucial role. The Louvre remained a global reference point for classical art, while institutions like the Musée d'Orsay played showcase the transformation into modern artistic styles. In film, the city's streets, architecture, and atmosphere made it one of the most filmed locations in the world. Paris was not just a backdrop, but it became a character in film itself. In music, fashion, and design, the city's influence was just as strong. What makes Paris unique in all this is not just that it dominates a single field, but it touches all of them at once. It's not just a city of art, literature, film, or philosophy. It's a city where all those things overlap, collide, and influence each other continuously. Because Paris does not simply produce culture, it absorbs it, transforms it, and reflects it back into the world. And that is why, even today, its influence remains so enduring. Not as a relic of history, but as a living centre of creativity that never stopped evolving. And so, as we reach the end of this journey through Paris, what remains is not just a single story, but thousands of them, layered on top of them like one city after itself, from the islands of the Parisi on the Seine, to Roman Lutetia, from medieval cathedrals rising stone by stone, to revolutions that overturned kings, to emperors who rebuilt ambition in stone and iron. and into a modern metropolis that has shaped how the world thinks, writes, paints, and films. Paris has never been still. It has been conquered, rebuilt, reimagined, and redefined again and again, yet it has never stopped being recognisably itself. Every street carries memory, every moment carries argument, every building carries a decision made by someone, somewhere, in a very different time. And yet the city moves forward. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Paris. It does not preserve history like a museum piece behind glass. It lives inside it, it argues with it, and it builds on top of it. And in doing so, it continues to shape the world far beyond its own borders. Because Paris is not just a single place on a map. It's an idea that keeps being rewritten. And as long as people continue to create, question, and imagine, Paris will continue to matter. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.